Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar event. My name is Joshua and I'm going to be your presenter today. My computer says it's a few seconds before 2, but my other devices say it's after 2 or at 2 p.m. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're here to talk about accounting, fund accounting, or funds defined. We're really going back to the basics of church windows and fund accounting here today, folks. The workbook we're going to be working with is A101, very first accounting workbook, pages 2 through 4. If you're interested in the workbooks, we do use as many of the workbook topics, from the church windows workbooks as possible. And our workbooks, of course, are for sale on our Church Windows website. I'm using those pages 2 through 4 as the basis for the webinar today. So if you are interested in that, please visit the Church Windows website, and under the beginning section there, you can find the workbooks page. You can purchase the workbooks from there. They're downloadable. They're PDF files. You can download them and print them yourself. They are, I think, $12 each, very affordable. You can pick and choose which ones you want. It's really great. But we are using that as the basis for our webinar. As always, we are recording this webinar event today, so the video of it will be available on our Church Windows website here in the next few days or so. Could be as soon as tomorrow, but probably more than likely sometime next week. We're going to work together till 20 after at the very latest. When I'm finished, I will wrap up what I'm talking about. I certainly won't be closing the webinar. I'll be happy to answer questions for folks. If you have any, please type those into the questions portion of the webinar. If at any point during the webinar, I'll try to keep an eye on those and see what I can't do to get those answered. I may be holding off and waiting till the end to answer those depending on our topic here. But it's not a terribly long topic, so maybe we will wrap things up a little bit early. We'll see. So, that's the most important thing. As we go into our accounting module, the thing that we have to keep in mind about Church Windows accounting is that it is a fund accounting system or software package, okay, designed for churches. It does interface over to our donations module and our payroll modules, but the chart of accounts, when it's constructed, is based on fund accounting, okay? So, folks look at it, and this is really the key to understanding how Church Windows accounting works differently from other accounting systems, is the concept of a fund or funds and what it or they do, as the case may be. Okay? So, we see on our chart of accounts here, and I'm just kind of pointing this out as I go through this, we've got our assets. Folks know what those are. Liabilities, assets are accounts we own. Liabilities are things that we owe. Income and expenses are very clear, but it's these accounts called fund balances here that really tend to throw folks for a loop. And that's what we're here to talk about today, is what is a fund, essentially. And as we see on our page 2 there in the box at the very top, I'm sorry if you don't have the workbook, but you can always go back and you can see that box I'm talking about. It says a fund defined. And in that box it says clearly a fund is an accounting entity, an account, essentially, that is set up to fulfill a designated purpose and to keep all its financial transactions separate from other funds. It generally has its own sources of income or income accounts and its own set of expenses, and its value is shown by the balance in the fund balance accounts. So that's really the crux to understanding what a fund is. Many times these are considered what we would consider on a traditional balance sheet and equity accounts. Okay? On a traditional for-profit balance sheet, we would see one owner's equity account. In the case of Church Windows, we might see, 2 or 3 or 5 or 30 or 50. It depends on how many funds the church has and how much, how the monies need to be kept separate for reporting purposes. Okay? Most churches will have, as we see here, a general operating fund. Okay? But as the page 2 on our workbook says, they may also have some other funds here, like as we see here, building fund, education building fund, missions, outreach, memorial, youth, anything that the church is wanting to keep money or track separately is generally going to be set up as a fund. Okay? As the bullet points establish here say, as well as when establishing a fund, you are in essence restricting those monies for the designated purpose of that fund. Even our general operating fund is a designation of money. Folks are giving money to the church for the purpose of the day-to-day operations and functioning of the church. That is our general fund. Okay? Any fund is a designation of money. Okay? It is money that's being tracked separately from other funds for the purposes of reporting. Okay? As the third bullet point on our workbook page talks about here on page 2 says, 2 factors decide whether money needs to be placed into its own fund. And by fund, we're not meaning assets. We're going to come to that here in a minute. But we're talking about these funds. Okay, 2 factors decide whether money needs to be placed into its own fund. Will there be money that carries over to the new year? Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 is, do you want to report on this money separate from other monies? Okay. When the answer to either of these questions, either or both of these questions is yes, then we're looking at setting up a separate fund. It's that simple. Okay? The fund is not always money, as the final bullet points there is. We do have here, like in this case, some churches will set up net fixed asset funds, basically for the value of the church, the building, contents, land, what have you. Okay, now this is not a requirement of church windows. But if the church decides to track those net fixed assets, that you would need a corresponding fund to balance or offset the corresponding net fixed asset value at the top of our chart of accounts, as we'll see here. Land and buildings, furniture and equipment. Okay? That may also be offset by a loan or a mortgage. So even then, our assets, land and building fixed assets, equals the amount of our mortgage or loan plus our fund balance. It's its own little mini balance sheet, essentially. Okay? Church windows accounting can have sub-funds. So as we see here, a very common example of a use of a fund with sub-funds is memorials. So we clearly see a main memorial fund balance here on our chart of accounts. Let me get up my highlighter, draw some focus here, right here. And it clearly has the little plus sign here on the left-hand side that when we do expand that, it does reveal each of the subsequent individual sub-memorial funds. Okay? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 memorial funds under that. Okay? When I did set up, or when I wanted to add more memorials, I would simply set up additional funds, sub-funds to that. Okay? The system does total into the main memorial fund balance here, but each one of those funds is a separate reporting and transaction entity or balance entity. So it's by looking at, say, my John Joseph Memorial Fund. If I click the balance tab, it clearly tells me we have $2,325 in his specific memorial fund. Okay? If I now go up to my main memorial fund balance here and I click the balance tab, it clearly tells me that in all of my memorials collectively, I have $8,480. It's by looking at each one of these separate memorial funds that I know how much each one of those funds has. Okay? That's true about funds in general. Whether we're dealing with funds or sub-funds, that just the main memorial fund in this case does report a total of all of my collective sub-funds. Okay? Page 3, talking about components of a fund. Okay? For a fund to operate and function properly, it needs the following. It needs a fund balance account, a 300 account, as we're seeing here, and we've got several of those. The fund needs to have at least one income account to credit or flow or add new money into it as we receive that. And it needs an expense, at least one expense, to expense or spend money from that fund. Okay? This is true 95% of the time. Okay? And as our example or our screenshot on page 3 of our workbook shows, when we now click over here under our Tree View tab and we click on something like our Memorial Fund, it shows us our Memorial Fund, and when we click the plus sign next to it, it does reveal the subsequent income and expense accounts that are linked to my building fund. And this is true for all of these accounts, with the exception of net fixed assets. Okay? There's a plus sign next to each one of my funds that does reveal the various income and expenses linked to each one of these funds. In some cases, like our Elliott Achidia Memorial Fund, it shows one income and one expense. Okay? But there may be other funds, like the general fund, that may have, a dozen or 2 dozen income accounts, and that same fund might have, multiple expense accounts, as we clearly see here. But in order to be able to, again, credit new money into the fund and expense money out of the fund, we have to have at least one income and one expense. Transactions can get posted directly to the fund itself in accounting using something like a journal entry, but those transactions are most likely rare, okay, on an as-need basis. Yeah, we want these monies to show up, this income and expense to show up either on our treasurer's report or on our fund activity report. So we've got to have those income and expenses if we expect our treasurer's report to be accurate and correct. Okay? Each fund is going to generally have, with the exception of something like net fixed assets, is going to have at least one income and one expense, and in some cases more. Okay? With that being said, let's talk a little bit about our ratio of assets to funds, as the case may be. There's a lot of confusion between how an asset and a fund are either different or they're the same. Okay? And as the middle of page 3 on our workbook page talks about, it says having different funds does not mean that money must be stored in different place. The money for each entity of the church may be stored in one checking account or in many different asset accounts. That's a really, again, important thing to understand about the software. It is by looking at the fund balance account, the 300 account here, that we know how much that fund has, or each fund has, regardless of which bank account it's stored in. In fact, I like to take it a step further by saying, before fund accounting systems like Church Windows Accounting became accepted and widely accepted, when a church wanted to open up or create a new fund, frequently they would go down to the bank and open up a new bank account because it was the easiest way to track that fund's money separate from other funds. Okay? So when I will oftentimes look at a chart of accounts, I'll see a church that will have, 10, 15, 20 different asset accounts, and they'll have a corresponding fund for each of those. Okay? Well, what I like to let folks know is I can't imagine having to reconcile all of those accounts each month. Okay? When you decide to use and set up Church Windows, at some point, hopefully you begin to realize, hey, we can get a handle on these assets and merge these down into fewer assets and keep the separation in these accounts at the bottom of our chart of accounts here called funds. Okay? Just because I have one, 2 or 3 or 5 funds doesn't mean I have to have multiple assets here at the top. In fact, I work with lots of churches where, for the simplicity's sake and just so they know where their money is, they have one asset at the top, and it's called general checking. Okay? And they know that by looking at any one of these funds down here at the bottom, how much of that one bank account belongs to each one of these funds. If you really want to, really bring it down to the lowest common denominator, it could be that simple. Your bank account is just an account that stores the money. Now that is, again, simplistic. Yes, many times we want to invest our money in an investment account or, earn interest in a money market or something. So that's completely reasonable. But there is no need to have in the software, a general checking for our general fund and a building savings for our building fund. Okay, as the final paragraph on page 3 talks about, it says coincidentally. I think that's a really important word. Or I would qualify that by saying by design, okay, or by choice. There may happen to be one asset that happens to contain the money that belongs to a particular fund. Okay? We've got a building fund that has its own separate, say money market account or savings account. But that is a choice that we make. It's not a requirement of Church Windows. Okay? As I've been telling folks for a long time, I've seen charts of accounts where there's one asset and 20 funds. Conversely, I've seen charts of accounts where they've got, one asset or 20 assets in one fund. The key is, are you happy with your reports? If you're happy with your reporting, there's nothing wrong with your chart of accounts. It's perfect. If your reports aren't right, then we may be needing to revisit it and figure out what we need to do to make it, better or more understandable or better for what the church's reporting needs are. Okay? And that's, again, what that final paragraph on page 3 talks about is funds and assets are different. They are not the same type of an account. Okay? As I learned a long time ago, there is no direct relationship between our assets and our funds other than a balance that they may share. Okay? The only thing that a fund and an asset may ever truly ever share in common is a balance. Okay? I know this is a kind of a difficult thing sometimes to wrap your head around, but it is, and it works. Okay? It's a system that works. I recommend frequently, hey, to a church, if they call me and ask my input on it, I go, hey, you've got, 15 different assets here. Are you sure you need that many? Or are we just hanging on to something based on how our old system didn't, have these accounts called funds that allows us to track the money separately that may be shared or stored in one particular bank account? Okay? On page 4, finally, it does show an example of how the church might have one checking account at the bank, and it shows how that distribution can occur over the different funds. Or in example 2, how there might be 2 different asset accounts, and again, those monies are distributed over multiple funds. I'm awfully in favor of, I like example 1 much better because, again, it's by looking at those funds, I know exactly how much of that checking account belongs to that. Example 2, where I've got a money market, that might be a little more challenging to track, but it certainly can be done. Okay? So the key, though, is looking back at that description or definition of a fund on page 1 is an accounting entity set up to fulfill a designated purpose, to keep its financial transactions separate from other funds, and each fund has its own separate income and expense accounts for tracking purposes. Okay? If you're interested in the next topic on that page there, where it's talking about using the Chart of Accounts wizard to set up your chart of accounts, I believe there is a webinar here later in September or in October that I'll be doing that will be covering the Chart of Accounts wizard. We're not going to be covering that today. Okay? But again, if you're interested in the workbook, please visit the workbook page on our website for that, A101, pages 2 through 4. I think it really does help with understanding fund accounting, and it's in a written format as opposed to looking at it here. So we got a couple more minutes here left before the 20 minutes are up here. So let me see what questions we got. All right, at the end of the webinar, will you tell us where we can find past webinars, such as the one, this is the budget one the other week, instructions as to where to find Church Windows website? Sure, of course. Yeah, this is a great question. If we go to our internet browser, we have our homepage, our website set as our homepage. If we go up to our supporting menu here and go to Support Center, great question. And we go to our Support Center here. There's the keyword here under our search for. Got to let the page load completely. So we click under search for, and frankly, now I don't know if, Linda, the one that was out there the other week is there, but I know we have definitely ones out there on budgets and budget. So if I type in the keyword budget, it shows accounting New Year budget. Yeah, that's probably it. It would be entering the New Year's budget. Again, this is version 17 and newer. It's probably from a prior year. So let's see when that was dated. This would have been down here at the bottom, probably under. Well, normally we do show when that was done here. So it's version 18 and newer, but it hasn't changed, frankly. So normally we put on here when we released that, but we didn't on this one. But it was probably last year sometime, but it's still relevant. It's the budget feature hasn't changed in the software that much, so this should work for you. And yeah, just go to www.churchwindows.com. From our homepage, click under the supporting menu and choose Support Center. That Support Center is chock full of previously recorded webinars and released. And I think you should be able to find lots of useful information there. You bet. Great. Next question. If you have 10 sub-memorial funds, can you have one of those sub-funds in a different bank account than the other submemorial funds? Absolutely, Diane. Yeah, the fact that you've got a fund set up does not restrict you in terms of which asset account those monies for those accounts are stored in, those funds. So definitively, yes. There's no question about that. Next question. We are currently using QuickBooks. Is the changeover to Church Windows generally pretty simple? Well, I think, Linda, the key to answering that question for you is, that, again, that you have to understand that QuickBooks is not a fund accounting system. So, it's really good that you're attending today's webinar event because, you're going to be working with a fund accounting system, let's go back to our website again because there's an important answer to this question here. So, I went on the wrong tab. So if we go back to our supporting page, this is going to be really important for you. If we click on Support Center again, here, this is a very important, is that as you're developing this, before the chart of accounts wizard, I know we've got a movie out there from the one from the previous year too, but if you go in here, you can go to the sample under the search, and there's an accounting sample chart of accounts. I'm going to definitely recommend that you look at that. It's a PDF file. You can print it out, have it available to you as you're writing down or putting your chart of accounts into QuickBooks, and compare it. Use it as as a guide as you're setting it up. But then when you've got that ready to go, there's no import function for the chart of accounts from QuickBooks into Church Windows, so it will have to be entered manually. But again, if you go into the search for field here and type in wizard and type it in, I know we've got a accounting chart of accounts window from last year. That will help. Yeah, that'll help definitely get stuff set up for you. And of course, if you're on support, please let us know. Please call us if you have questions about it. But start with the sample chart of accounts, review the chart of accounts wizard. I think that's a great place to start. Good question. You're welcome. Thank you, Gloria. Okay, I'm just kind of waiting to see if anybody's typing any more questions. I don't see anything coming in. Fund accounting, folks, is challenging. But if you can understand what funds do differently, income and expense accounts zero out at the beginning of each accounting year. So if you need to track a balance forward separately, rather than having to do the math and maintain separate spreadsheets, set up funds. We can relink income and expense accounts over to the funds. You can always transfer the balance into a new asset if you need to. But funds are really powerful tools to help you track money separately from other funds, regardless of which bank account they're stored in. A bank account or an asset simply becomes an account that holds our money. That's it. Nothing else. It's not a fund necessarily. So anyway, it's about 23 minutes after the hour. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar for everybody. We hope it's been helpful. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you at another Church Windows webinar. All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.